So the topic of today's video might seem a little bit niche. No-sew crochet amigurumi pattern drama. What is that? You might be asking yourself. But I do think that this speaks to a larger problem that I'm seeing within the crochet community and really just with the internet at large. But we'll get to all of that in a little bit. First, welcome to the Faded Wildflower Crochet. My name is Rachel. If you don't already know me, I make crochet content here on YouTube. I have been crocheting for 15 years and I do primarily make amigurumi. I say all of this just to say that I am trying to come at this as neutral as possible, but I do come with some biases into this conversation, which we will get to as we go along. So the main social media platform that I use is Threads. I used to be a lot more active on all of the social media platforms, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, but I've been kind of taking a little bit of a social media break, but I do pop in once in a while to see what's going on. And I just kept seeing discourse of different sides of the coin when it came to no-sew amigurumi patterns. Now, if you clicked on this video and you have no idea what I'm talking about, let me throw some definitions at you. First of all, amigurumi is just crocheted plushies. It's just another name for crocheted stuffed animals. Now, for as long as I've been crocheting, the primary way that you make amigurumi is to crochet all of the pieces and then sew them together. But lately, no-sew patterns have become more popular. Now, no-sew just means that instead of using your yarn tail to sew the pieces together, you crochet the pieces together. Or it might just be crocheted all in one piece that you don't need to attach any pieces. Now that is what no-sew means. And then you also see low-sew, which just means that there might be a little bit of sewing involved, but not much. So that is what we're talking about today, is particularly the rise of no-sew patterns. Now, as I see it, there are a few different reasons why no-sew patterns have become so popular lately. One reason is because crochet has had a boom recently. There are so many new people learning how to crochet. And when people are learning this new skill and they really want to learn how to make a stuffed animal, they don't want to also have to take the time to learn how to sew, because sewing is truly a skill unto itself. So they really just want to be able to complete a finished plushie without having to do the sewing. They already learned this new skill of crochet. They don't want to have to also learn the skill of sewing. So a lot of no-sew patterns are beginner friendly for that reason. Another reason is because, let's face it, sewing does take time. And a lot of people are wanting to make plushies for markets. They want to take their plushies to a farmer's market or just some sort of craft fair, and they want to sell their items. And the fact that sewing takes more time is making it where they can't have as many plushies at their booth. So they want to save time. So they want to use a no-sew pattern to help them with that. Now, another reason that I suspect that no-sew patterns have become so popular is because more and more people are using chenille yarn to make their plushies. And famously, chenille yarn is harder to sew with. Now, there are better chenille yarns than others, which is a whole other video topic on its own. But the most popular of chenille yarns fall apart when you try to sew with them. So it's easier if you have a no-sew pattern, and that way you don't even have to think about sewing your plushies together and having all the fuzz fall off of your yarn. So another reason why people might choose a no-sew pattern is because it is more disability friendly. Now, I have to admit, I didn't really understand this at first, and I had to ask on Threads, and some people were giving different responses. One reason can be that they have hypermobility, and the larger range of motion that it takes to sew can hurt their shoulder, things like that. Other people were saying they have mobility issues, and holding these tiny little pieces together and trying to sew with them is just too hard on their joints. Other people were saying that they have ADHD, and trying to switch between the task of crochet and then switch over to sewing is just too much for them sometimes. So they choose a no-sew pattern. So where does the drama come in, you might be asking yourself? And I'm going to tell you right off the bat that I'm not going to be including anybody's usernames, any screen names, nothing like that, because I just don't feel like it's necessary for the story. I might be adding some screenshots on the screen just to give you some context, but I just don't think that it's necessary to include anybody's usernames. I'm sorry if that makes the story like less juicy or something, but I just don't think that we need to be going and sending hate to any of these people involved. So I am going to be blocking out any usernames in this video. So I do see this discussion pop up from time to time, people saying that I hate no-sew patterns. I love no-sew patterns. And then it kind of dies down and then it'll come back up again. And I think the reason that it came back up this time is because somebody shared a screenshot of a person who left a review on their Etsy pattern saying, I liked this pattern, but it had too much sewing, and they left a lower than 5-star rating. If you don't already know, it can be quite detrimental to Etsy sellers if you give them anything below a 5-star rating, because Etsy has started this thing where they will put your listings lower in the rank if you do not have a 5-star rating. And now this is fair for shops that maybe deserve a lower than 5-star rating because they don't have great products or whatever it is. But for people who don't deserve that, it can be really frustrating. And I can totally understand why this person was frustrated, because they didn't do anything wrong. They sold a pattern, the person bought it, and they were mostly happy with it, but they weren't happy that they had to sew. And it seems like we almost have to start advertising our patterns as so heavy instead of having to just advertise them as a amigurumi pattern. And like I said, traditionally, amigurumi patterns involve sewing. And so most people know going into an amigurumi pattern, I'm going to have to sew, unless it's labeled as no-sew. So I can totally see why this person was really frustrated and why other designers, and myself included, can be frustrated when it comes to this, because it feels like we have to do a little bit more of the work for people and explaining, you have to do some sewing in this, as opposed to that person taking the time to find out if this pattern was in fact no-sew or not. So it seems that people were getting upset because there is this expectation now that patterns be no-sew, even when you don't advertise them as no-sew. And there can be this pressure that is put on designers to have everything be no-sew, because the fact of the matter is that pattern is probably going to sell better if it's no-sew. And I have to admit that I have felt this pressure myself. Most of my patterns do require a heavy amount of sewing, but I do have one no-sew pattern, which we will talk more about in a little bit. But I have to admit that this is something that I think about when I'm designing a new pattern. Like, is anybody going to buy it? Because it involves a lot of sewing. So because that was shared, a lot of people started coming out with their opinions of no-sew patterns versus sewing patterns. And the most controversial of these opinions were people saying that no-sew patterns means that you have less skill, or that you are perhaps lazy. Now, you can see that this could ruffle some feathers, and people were responding back that that was an ableist take because of all of the reasons that I mentioned earlier. Other people were saying that they're just tired of seeing no-sew patterns because they look like unrecognizable blobs, and that if you want more detail to your amigurumi, you're gonna have to do some sewing. And so people were responding to this saying, actually, it takes me as a designer more to explain a no-sew pattern than it does to explain a sewing pattern. I do have to kind of sort of agree with this take. Like I mentioned, I do have one no-sew pattern, which is my squid, and it is one of my most popular designs. And I really did have to confer with my pattern testers on how to explain a certain round of this, which would probably be easier to explain if I just told you to sew it. But because you are crocheting pieces together and, you know, it can be a little bit more complicated. You want to come say hi, don't you? I was getting a little heated and Lily had to come say hi. Of course, you can't see her, but of course I will put a clip of her. I appreciate your service. Can you go lay down? Can't remember exactly where I was at, but I was explaining the fact that when it comes to no-sew patterns, sometimes it can be a little bit harder to explain what you're doing. Whereas if you just told somebody to sew, it could actually be a little bit easier. I have to admit that that is true from time to time. However, I think that the person giving that opinion may just be looking at one certain type of no-sew patterns, whereas other no-sew patterns can actually be quite complex. I shared in a hot take video a while back that I really didn't like the trend towards no-sew patterns, and that I think that if you want to learn how to sew, then the only way to do it is to practice, which I do still kind of stand by. I think if you want to learn to sew, if you want to have a lot more patterns available to you, you are going to have to learn how to sew. However, I think that listening to other people's opinions has helped me realize that some people may not be able to do sewing patterns, or maybe they just don't want to do sewing patterns, and that's okay. So at the end of the day, I feel like this comes down to something that like I said, am seeing a bigger problem with within our crochet community and within the internet. And that is, first of all, a lack of nuance. And second of all, a lack of understanding of other people's perspectives. So when it comes to nuance, I think somebody stating, I prefer to make and sell patterns that involve sewing. If that is all they're saying, responding to them that they're ableist for saying that is not really helpful. It's not showing the nuance that that person was just trying to say, hey, I prefer sewing. On the other side of the coin, if somebody is saying, I prefer no-sew patterns, that doesn't automatically make them a beginner. It doesn't automatically make them lazy. And I think that using these sweeping judgments is really not helpful. When you make a statement like no-sew patterns are only for lazy people, that's not really helping to build community between other crocheters. You're sharing that to be divisive, and I just don't really like seeing that. I personally think that this really all comes down to personal preference, which I do emphasize all the time on this channel when I'm reviewing a yarn or a crochet kit. I might not like something, but you might like something. And there really are just so many crocheters in the world. And with all the different crocheters, there are all these different opinions. And I think that if you look at your own opinion and think that it is the right opinion and everybody else is wrong, it's really just not a very nuanced way of looking at the world. I see this a lot when it comes to people trashing other people's yarn choices as well. This was a debate that went around for a while of people who say you should only use natural fibers when it comes to crochet. And if you use acrylic and polyester, then you're not actually really a crocheter or a knitter or whatever the conversation may be. And I really just don't like this either. I think that the fact of the matter is some people like only using natural fibers. Some people only like using polyester or acrylic. Some people like using both. And at the end of the day, we are all fiber artists in our own right. I think that assuming that you are a better crocheter or knitter if you use natural fibers than somebody who uses unnatural fibers, it's this superiority complex that I don't like seeing. And the same goes for no-sew versus sewing patterns. People who do really complex sewing patterns might sometimes have this superiority complex and think that they're a better crocheter than somebody who uses no-sew patterns. But I think if you come at it with that mindset, then you are not leaving room to understand the different reasons why somebody might choose a no-sew pattern. And the fact of the matter is, maybe they're choosing a no-sew pattern because they don't want to sew. They just hate it. And that's a valid reason as well. It might sound a little bit kumbaya of me to be like, why can't we all just get along? But really, why can't we all just get along? I just don't think that there's any reason why somebody should be judging somebody else's choice of pattern or yarn. Because at the end of the day, it has nothing to do with you. You can prefer to use complex sewing patterns with only cotton all you want, but this person over here might only like using plush yarn and might only like using no-sew patterns. At the end of the day, you're both crocheters and it doesn't really matter. Now, all of that being said, if you are a person who prefers no-sew patterns, please do not leave bad reviews on people's patterns just because they involve sewing. I think the onus is on you to make sure that a pattern does not involve sewing before you buy it, because it's really unfair to somebody to leave a bad review on their product because you didn't read the listing properly. So that is all I have for you guys today. You will have to let me know if you have seen this discourse going around and what you guys think about it. Did I miss anything? I really just hate seeing these sort of silly debates that at the end of the day don't really matter. Nobody's hurting anybody by only preferring no-sew patterns. Nobody's hurting anybody by only preferring sewing patterns. Really, it's just personal preference. And I really do think that if we have a little bit more open-mindedness when it comes to this, we could all get along. I don't know, maybe that's asking too much. As always, if you made it to this part of the video, I want to know, what were you working on as you watched today's video? If you did like today's video, be sure to hit the like button. You can subscribe, stick around. Let me know what other kind of videos you want to see next. You can join my Patreon where I make a bonus video as well as an exclusive pattern once a month. And most of my patterns do involve sewing, but you know, if you like that, then they're there for you. And thank you again for watching. I'll see you next time.